Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we contemplate humanity flourishing, this is a challenging notion if you tracking these news and what's been going on in the markets and in the situation with the war in Ukraine and related matters around the world. It doesn't appear that humanity is flourishing. Just starting with the market, NASDAQ lost over $1 trillion in value over the last 24, 48 hours. The so-called Magnificent Seven stocks, which include Tesla, have plummeted. Even Bitcoin is down to a level it hasn't been in for a very long time. The Trump administration has been on again, off again with Canada and Mexico, threatening tariffs, 25, 50%. China is being tariffed, and the world financial systems are convulsing with the unpredictability of the Trump presidency. This has been one of the most turbulent beginnings of a presidential administration in recent times in terms of the markets. The situation with regards to Europe and Ukraine and the Russians and so forth are equally turbulent. Trump meanders with his intelligence, as we all have come to know, and says things that are excessive and pompous, and then they either disappear or they turn into their opposites. The meeting with President Zelensky early last week has created consternation. The Americans met with the Ukrainians yesterday and today in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, specifically saying that President Zelensky was not invited, that he needed to send his subordinates. Who knows what they're actually going to be talking about? There's rumors that the United States wants Zelensky out. And then out of the blue, the Ukrainians launch their biggest drone attack. Some 337 drones against Russian facilities, 91 drones against Moscow in particular, causing damage and fires and disruption of the train services and various other normal business activities. And so the world is adapting reflexively to a man in the White House who, while he's disrupting markets and the geostrategic infrastructure, has unleashed Elon Musk with a chainsaw to go after the federal bureaucracy. I'll be saying a lot more about this on Thursday when I'm going to take the whole session to provide commentary on these matters, because I think it's extremely important that all of us connect the dots here within a larger framework of history and geostrategic balance of powers within which the Trump administration is operating. It is not operating tabula rasa. It's operating with contextual forces that are bigger than Trump, bigger than the United States. which are working the will of history in the aftermath of excess, militarism, and colonial arrogance. And the more we understand these matters, the more we'll understand both the challenges and the urgency for humanity to rise, for humanity to flourish. Because the depth of the crisis unfolding all around us is a measure of the magnitude of the opportunities for humanity flourishing also all around us. If we can just torque our consciousness and move beyond the consciousness that produced the problem to a new consciousness that allows us to see the solutions inherent in the very problems our old consciousness is creating and sustaining. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here on Humanity Rising. It's always such a rich conversation and rich experience. Thank you. And now I'd like to bring back on Humanity Rising my very good friend and colleague, Tom Eddington, who's really the co-convener of Humanity Rising with all the work that he's been doing, and also my comrade in arms as we launched the State of the World Forum, which we've been talking about. And it was Tom that first met Peter Fikowski, who's our presenter for today. So Tom, welcome. And you tee us up with Peter, and then we'll commence our dialogue.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Delightful to be here today, especially this conversation on humanity flourishing. I've been doing a lot of work this last year in the area of flourishing, working with some of my clients and a colleague to help shift the way that humanity does business. Our way of doing business in the world is based on extraction. And as a result, we're now beyond the planetary boundaries by 4 to 5 times. The way that we interact with each other in most business settings is very transactional, is based on extraction. And we need to move to a generative frame. And so my colleague and I have been working with clients and companies to look at how do they shift from extraction to flourishing. And so I'm particularly excited about this conversation today and delighted to have Peter joining us to talk about humanity and to talk about flourishing. And Jim, I especially appreciated your framing of this conversation because we know that oftentimes the solutions that get created are because we define the problem in the wrong way. And so there's an opportunity for us to recognize all of the flourishing that's going on in the world and recognize that flourishing is formidable. It's, you know, if we look at Mother Nature, and I'll pick on the desert in Southern California. When the bloom happens in the spring, it's extraordinary. Absolutely, I mean, just awe-inspiring. And yet 11 months out of the year, it looks like a desert. It looks like there's nothing that could possibly bloom there. And we can look to nature and use biomimicry to help remind us that flourishing is formidable, but it's all around us if we just pay attention. And so with those opening comments, I'd love to have Peter join us and get into this rich conversation on humanity flourishing.
Peter, as we begin, tell your story. Tell your, anything you want from your youth, getting into high tech. You've been a very successful high tech entrepreneur. Turned out, as a rare exception to most, you had a conscience. And so you ended up founding I Am Humanity and really passionately seeking to bring humanity flourishing uh, into the world. But tell us our story as we begin our dialogue.
Thank you. Yeah, Jim and Tom, thank you for organizing the series and Humanity Rising and Ubiquity University. It's a gift to all of humanity. Yeah, I'm not telling you anything you didn't already know, but it's great to remember these things. We take them personally. Yeah, but they are personal, but they belong to all of us. So yeah, I grew up in Washington, D.C. back in the 60s. And it, yeah, my family was a bunch of economists. My dad was a chief economist at U.S. Treasury, and he was always complaining about what was going on. If you remember Richard M. Nixon, um, it was crazy times. But the presidents before and after, and so I had this experience of the craziness of the world, and uh, the irrationality of it. And that sent me straight to the rationality of physics. And so I've been a physicist ever since, since I was probably 9 or something. I didn't know what physics was in the beginning, but I knew that it was a lot more rational than what was going on in Washington, D.C. And certainly is better more than what's going on now. Uh, yeah, I studied astrophysics at MIT and came out here to Silicon Valley. Um, didn't know what to do with myself other than make a difference in the world. Uh, Along the way, so I did astrophysics. I got tired of that. It was fun working at NASA for a few years, and then went to an AI lab, artificial intelligence lab. I don't have to say artificial intelligence anymore. Now everyone knows what it is. But back in 1983, it was novel, and I got to work there for a while and learned about semiconductor manufacturing because that's the company that owned it, and started a business doing software for semiconductor manufacturing. But along the way, uh, I did courses, and one of my courses came up with a mission statement. The final assignment was come up with a personal mission statement. And what I ended up with after many iterations was that my mission in life is to leave a world that we're proud of to our children. And I suspected it might be a fateful decision, and I was right. Because about 8 years later, I realized that uh, I was not willing to give my children a climate that they wouldn't survive in. Right? It's that simple. I imagine almost every listener has had that thought, even if they've never expressed it. But unfortunately or fortunately, the message on my wall called that into question. And so I started the movement to restore a safe climate for our children, um, which sounds innocent enough, but it turns out that it actually opposes the UN, because the UN climate goal is to stabilize emissions and stabilize greenhouse gas levels at a level that prevents human interference in the climate system. Well, that point we passed in 1988, 33 years ago. And the UN has not adjusted to the fact that the planet is not the same planet that they wrote up their mission for. And so all of our climate action is appropriate to 1980, but certainly not to 2020 or 2025. And so restoring the climate is not stabilizing it, it's restoring it and then stabilizing it. And so it's been a wild ride. And along the way, uh, uh, I always found people agreed with it, but they were uncomfortable with it. And I could see that over time, I could see that the discomfort was that people identify with their immediate life. So with their family, with their income, with their prestige, and so on, with their house and their community. And restoring the climate doesn't affect your income significant. It might, but it doesn't affect any of those. And so people would get interested and then lose interest. And so we were forced to create what we call I am humanity, which is just a perspective, which is very similar to I am American, I'm a Californian, I'm Jewish, I'm a physicist, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather. It's just a perspective. It's actually a kind of a consciousness, right? There's an I am father consciousness. Well, so we created out of nothing, I am humanity as a consciousness, which you can call on. And it's been effective. So the support globally for restoring a safe climate is picking up exponentially. We're not there yet. I imagine that half the listeners hadn't heard the concept of restoring the climate yet, but now you have, and you should share it. So that's the most part. The second aspect of this is along the way, while I was, building my career and building um, uh, the climate work, I was doing health poverty work, and I saw that I didn't like the idea that we measured hunger and poverty against saving lives. And I read somewhere, I think most of you have heard this, that everyone dies eventually. So there was really no such thing as saving a life, that all you could do is extend a life. And if you talk about extending a life, you ask, like, why? Like, is it a better life? And if it's a better life, who is it a better life for? And that takes us right to humanity flourishing and the difference between human flourishing and humanity flourishing.
So, Peter, can you define how you hold flourishing?
Yeah, I thought about it a lot. Flourishing is living as designed. So you talked about the flowers in the desert. They're designed to blossom and then die away until the next rains. Um, and there's nothing wrong with their dying away after they blossom. That's the way they're designed. Humans are designed to be born and grow up and go through adolescence and adulthood, get old, and eventually die, and that's okay. Um, so that's flourishing is living as we're designed.
Okay. And when I think about what does it mean to be human, and my colleague Dr. Lisa Miller talks about how each of us are a particle and a wave. And so when you talk about humanity flourishing, I'm assuming you're referencing that we each are a particle and we're also a wave.
Yeah, Tom, I'd never thought of it that way. I use the analogy of a bee and a beehive. Because that's very tangible. If I'm studying bees, that's a good thing. If I'm studying a beehive, that's a good thing. But they're conjoined and they're different, and you look at different things. The particle and the wave, as a physicist, I'm not too comfortable with that. I mean, I am in physics, but in terms of the equating it to humanity, not so much. But it's interesting.
Not to take us down a rabbit hole, but I'm curious to get your reaction. So, humanity's been on this planet for 240,000 years, and over the course of that 240,000 years, what have we achieved? We've managed to eradicate hundreds of thousands of species. We've managed to liberate something in excess of 300 gigatons of carbon from the soil and the earth into the atmosphere. And if you subscribe to the energy of the universe is love, we've generated a tremendous amount of love, a tremendous amount of energy. What else has our species done when we look at it through the lens of humanity flourishing? And you talk about design.
Hmm. Oh, that's interesting. One thing is our language and technology have allowed us to modify the planet. So far, we've modified it in mostly not such good ways, global warming and uh, extincting a lot of species. On the other hand, we now have the ability to restore the climate, to restore, say, CO2 levels, just leveraging how nature does it, but doing it at the right place in the right time. We haven't implemented that yet, and growing numbers of us are working on it. So the possibility of humanity flourishing for 1 million years is actually a viable possibility. Um, if yeah, yeah, that's sort of what I would say. And I'm not, yeah, I'll ask you, why is it important what we accomplish as humanity?
It's a good question. I mean, if we look at the 240,000 years we've been here, it's only the last couple 100,000 where we've done a lot of the damage to the planet. I mean, most of the time we've been on this planet, we have coexisted in an extraordinarily beautiful way with nature, with each other. And not to bring AI into the conversation too much, but AI has been around for about 80 years, and perhaps that's part of the intelligence of AI, is to help bring us back into harmony with each other and with the planet.
I'd like to probe your question, Tom. I think you're asking some very powerful questions here. Peter, what do you believe human beings are actually designed to be, designed to do? You know, we talked about the desert and the flowers coming up. I have flowers behind me to my left there, beautiful lilies, and they're just bursting out of their pods, and they're going to get just exuberant, then they're going to fall.
Yeah.
Humans seem to me not to be so simply constructed. So I was wondering, what do you think in your mind humans are really designed to do or to be?
Hmm. Well, I guess evolutionarily, humanity, has filled a niche, right? Of where you can use intelligence to travel around the planet, inhabit the planet, modify the planet in a way that other species haven't done that. No, the other species can, you can make dams and beavers can make dams and so on. But there's an evolutionary niche for using intelligence and tools to keep our species and our ecosystem alive for a long time. And so, for example, our ability, if an asteroid were to threaten the planet now, we would probably be able to protect ourselves from that. And that wasn't possible 100 years ago. That,
Yeah.
that makes sense?
It makes sense, but it makes me really ponder how you understand flourishing. Um, if you go back into the biblical tradition, be fruitful and multiply, and have dominance over the earth. That was in a sense how we conceived flourishing. Humanity, for the thousands of years, we've conceived our flourishing as our capacity to adapt to any ecological niche and establish dominance over that niche through technology. If you think about what we've essentially done, would you understand that as flourishing, or would you understand flourishing in a more value ridden way to mean something else?
That's a fantastic question. Um, because when I look at biblical times, flourishing meant that our tribe uh, went well. Yeah, and most of the time, your tribe is like a business, is either expanding or
Yeah, yeah.
contracting. And so, f- flourishing and that having lots of kids meant that you weren't dying. Um, Now, we've we've come to the end of that chapter where the planet isn't dominated by Greeks and Romans or British empires or Dutch empires, but the planet now is really just one humanity. We're all intermingled, we're intermarrying, our cultures intermingle. We love the variety and diversity, but we actually have to redefine flourishing. Right, because as I said, flourishing in historical times meant our
Yeah,
culture, our tribe.
yeah.
Now that doesn't work. You get wars like we're getting now, and you started talking about the political situation now, which is historically based on us versus them. The good news is a lot of us have the tools that we can overcome this. The time will change. Um, and that's my point is that we're coming to a new chapter on humanity and the earth, where it's now the dominant way of being is not American. The three of us are Americans. It's now about being human. And we have to write a new rule book. And so what I learned in my hunger and poverty work and my visits and various conversations, the measure that my heart responded to was kids dancing and singing. Like when the kids were dancing and singing, uh, like, okay, that's what we're supposed to do. Uh, and it was interesting, right? Because this is back in the 90s, and we would go places, and and much of the time the kids would stop dancing and singing because life got too complicated because they had to earn money now, whereas they used to just go and have fruit. And that's a very gross simplification, but the point is we have a new chapter and we have to redefine flourishing for this chapter, and I think that's why the three of us are here.
Yeah, I think you're making a very incisive point here. It's not that we weren't flourishing and now we need to. We've over flourished using a very successful adaptive strategies and increasingly sophisticated technology. But that very success has produced a problem that is about ready to destroy us. And therefore, we need to completely redefine what we mean by flourishing. That's
Yes.
really the challenge that you're posing to us. It's not flourishing itself, but how humanity seeks to flourish. And I think this is part of the contradiction of Donald Trump, for example. His notion of flourishing is to go back to President McKinley, over 100 years ago,
Right.
and put tariffs on everybody and get into a protective mentality so that America can flourish vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And what's obvious to anybody that understands your point that it's no longer the nation state that needs to govern, but humanity at large in an interconnected web, the flourishing of the United States is no longer flourishing because it's damaging the whole and ultimately damaging itself.
Yeah.
So speak to us about how would you define this new modality of flourishing? What does that look like to you?
Yeah. So the old one, as we said, was my tribe and country dominating yours. And again, we see that in today's politics. The new one is all of humanity, humanity flourishing for millennia or a million years to come. And that evokes a whole new set of problems. In the old paradigm, wars got people active and busy and creative and so on. I don't want to advocate for war, but you know, we had wars and we progressed. That's not going to keep going. It's just clearly not going to keep happening. And so now flourishing means that to flourish for another 1,000 or 1,000,000 years, we have to restore a safe climate so we can survive because we do have a biology. We are dependent on a certain ecosystem. Scientists call it the Holocene, where agriculture developed. So we have to restore the climate. We have to restore sane population. Tom talked about 5 times more resources than the planet can supply. Well, interesting. We also have 4 or 5 times more people than the planet was ever able to sustain long term. It's not rocket science, and fortunately, young people are having fewer children, and it takes a few decades, but the population arc is heading back to humanity flourishing, to actually having that population and the climate. And then, the other thing that I see as really critical is making sure that the humans we produce are healthy. And so that there's a thing or an idea that was brought up in the 90s. They call it the first 1,000 days. So the first 1,000 days after a woman conceives, that her health and the health of the infant that gets born is critical to the uh, resilience of the adults that come out of that. The child grows into an adult eventually, and making sure that the woman and the infant are well fed and healthy and not too stressed out means that you're going to have adults who are resilient, creative, and delightful to be around. And so just I see those three things are the critical ones: the climate, the population, and we need a better term for it, but for the first 1,000 days. You get those in place, and you can mess up almost anything else and be just fine. We don't need to mess anything else up, but as an entrepreneur, I always focus on what's the highest risk issue, and let's deal with a high risk issue. And those are the three.
So Peter, maybe just picking up on one of the points you made. So the world population now is about 8.2 billion. The estimates I've seen are we're going to grow to about 11.5 billion. And with the diminishing birth rates, particularly in a number of countries around the world, the population is going to stabilize at a number. I don't know that anybody knows for certain what that's going to be, and then we probably will see a decline in human population on the planet. But of the 8.2 billion that exists right now, I would argue there are millions and millions of human beings that are already flourishing in the way that you define flourishing. And so I'm wondering if you could just speak to, it's easy for us to talk about all the perils, all of the horrible things happening on the planet. But the reality is the vast majority of humanity is flourishing already. And can you speak to that a bit more?
Yeah, no, that's great that the vast majority of humanity is flourishing. Um, but humanity isn't, right? The wildfires in LA and the sea level rise and the litany of eco collapses. Humanity includes all of nature, right? That you can't have humanity without nature. You can have nature without humanity. And if you look objectively, say, oh, we're pushing to have nature without humanity. But we older folks feel an obligation to make sure that it's nature, including humanity, growing, flourishing. And so I forgot what your question was.
I was just asking if you can speak to where we know there are millions of humans around the planet that are flourishing, communities that are flourishing.
Yeah, well, here I am in Silicon Valley, and things are going well. Of course, there's a lot of homeless, so that's a big black mark. But on the other hand, I can look at my heritage being Jewish and my grandparents and great grandparents in Poland. Things are good there, but they weren't so good, during the Holocaust. And my point is, mm, I'm personally totally interested in humanity flourishing and what it takes for that to happen, because these catastrophes are going to happen. Now we can minimize them for sure, but and there will always people will always focus on minimizing them. That's our nature. I've been fortunate in being in places where it's just I'm always looking over the next hill. That's what my parents did. That's what I learned at MIT. Working in Silicon Valley, we're always looking at what's the technology going to be like in 10 or 15 years. And I'm fortunate that that's the game I get to play. And that's why what I really want us to be doing is distinguishing between human flourishing, which is important and we all love. And I love listening to the podcast, which helps me understand how to flourish better, live better, more energetic life. But then those of us who have the time and resources to focus on humanity flourishing, we better do that, because very few people have the luxury that people like the three of us have to look at the whole world. And the other thing, Tom, I'll take issue with you on a sort of issue on this, that you said, well, we don't know what population the planet's going to end up at. Of course, that's true. On the other hand, um, we know enough physics and enough history to know that it'll end up about the same level of global birth rate, which I forgot what it is, 80 million a year, I think is what it is. That that was what the global birth rate was in the 1700s and 1800s, about 80 million children born every year. Children are really expensive resource wise. I think the three of us are grandparents, and it's so interesting when my kids had their kids, my grandkids, all of a sudden my trash bins were full again. Overflowing, the recycling and the organics, everything was overflowing. And I realized it's true. All of our resources go into kids. So if you, it's pretty clear that what our planet can hold is about 80 million kids a year on the planet. And that comes out to 2 billion. And so it's interesting, we discussed yesterday in preparation about one of my experiences growing up was uh, I was doing astrophysics research. In high school, my best friend, his mom was a very famous, or ended up being a very famous astrophysicist. And so she was working on understanding the Big Bang and how was it going faster here or faster here or here. And so to do that, the 17-year-old, she asked me to come in and look at the Palomar st Sky Atlas at thousands and thousands of these spiral galaxies. You can't imagine how many thousands I had to look at. And again, as a physicist, I knew each of those galaxies had 100 billion stars, and most of those stars had a planet or two. And I was like, after about a month, I realized, you know what? Each one of those galaxies has at least 1,000 pimply 17-year-olds like me looking at the light table at
Yeah.
the Palomar Sky Atlas, saying, each of those galaxies has a pimply 17-year-old like me, and they'd be right. And so it's a privilege to have had that experience and realize, oh, if we're going to survive, we better take care of that future intentionally. Because we all know that that's not the way the train is going. And if I wanted to pull up a slide, I call it the blip. And so all of us have seen the graphs um, from the climate graphs, go like this and like that, the hockey stick graphs of temperature and CO2. And well, that's a disaster. Well, any populations go through that, right? If I have ants in my back porch sometimes, right? Their population goes up and then comes back down again. That populations do that. So I'm I want everyone to be thinking about global warming as a blip, that something went out of control, right? Our intelligence and our technology went out of control, and we did this, and then we corrected. Now, the thing is that our language is so important. And so, but our language allows us to control the future. When President Kennedy said we're going to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, it was almost like God's, in retrospect, it was almost like God saying that, like everything aligned and thousands of patents and inventions happened. That rate has not happened since. So, 2 billion is probably what it will be. Now, whether it's 1 3/4 or 2 3/4, I don't think it makes much difference. Um, but you can actually predict these things. And then if you just physically predict it, then we can adjust our policies and our thinking to produce it, just like Kennedy produced our thinking to land on the moon and come back safely.
So just picking up on one of your points, Peter, when you talked about the work you were doing to eradicate hunger on the planet. So certainly when I think about humanity flourishing or human flourishing, we've got our physical body, and so we've tended to the malnourishment of the physical body over the last 50 years, and most people on the planet now, that's no longer a problem. When we look at the collective of humanity on the planet, I would say we're suffering from spiritual malnourishment. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that in the context of humanity flourishing.
Mm, yeah. Jim addressed that a little bit in the very beginning. He talked about a new consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, well, what's the new consciousness? Well, it, the old consciousness is our tribe surviving and surviving well, which means dominating. That's the old consciousness. And it was required because if any tribe didn't have that consciousness, they got defeated. That was the end of that. The new consciousness, it appears to be humanity flourishing for millennia. And because when you're aware of that, and your idea of climate rather than disaster is, oh, it's a blip, we're correcting. That consciousness of correcting and population, okay, yeah, correcting it, the way birth rates are going, our population will be fine in less than 100 years. I've done it's not hard to do those calculations on Excel. It's once I created that consciousness of humanity flourishing for millennia. So that's the new consciousness, is seeing that future, and then each of us seeing the way that we'll contribute to it. And I think it's important to realize that putting in guardrails seldom works, right? Because people always resist guardrails. Not always, but there are always people who resist guardrails. And so the guardrails don't work. Uh, dire punishment, the death penalty, they don't work they certainly have some effect. What works is a common vision. In the Christian era, the common vision was going to heaven. Um, now going forward, I say our common vision is going to be humanity flourishing and just people being healthy and not fighting wars for the most part. When I say for the most part, I've seen pictures of soccer matches, which looked a little bit warlike, but to each his own.
Yeah, I mean, it's always good to remind ourselves that yes, there have been wars, but by and large, most of human existence has been absent of war. There have been conflicts at various places on the planet, but most people have not experienced war and won't in their lifetime.
Yeah, yeah,
And the absence of war is not what I'm hearing your definition of flourishing.
that's right. That's right. It's very interesting. I mean, it's sort of like, as I said, I back in the 90s, we were being so successful in hunger and poverty issues, and child survival rates went up fourfold. Just amazing. And in retrospect, I think, oh my God, all of my work that I was doing to increase child survival, I was hoping someone else was worrying about reducing the birth rate. But I was working on child survival. Well, the fact that we have 4 times more people alive now than we did in 1920 when my parents were born, 4 times more people on the planet. I'm to blame, not per, we're to blame for that in our bleeding heart. Not saying we should have done something different, because if we could have, we would have. But in retrospect, that focus on human flourishing was to our detriment.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question because at the time a lot of the work was happening around infant mortality rates. There was also selectively around the world a lot of work going into supporting women to have access to school, to education. And so countries like Bangladesh, when the women were given the opportunity to go to school, we saw the birth rates and the average family size drop from 11 children down to 2 point something.
Yeah.
And so it's taking that more systemic and holistic approach to what does it mean to be human, and having a shared understanding of humanity.
Yeah, well, the Bangladesh, I think, is a really good example because Muhammad Yunus established the Grameen Bank and the whole field of microfinance. And in retrospect, one of the key things when he started out, women was mainly women who joined the microfinance groups. And one of their agreements was to limit their family to 3 children, which was coming down from 6, was a really big deal. Um, in the old consciousness of uh, my tribe not being defeated by your tribe, 3 made a lot of sense. If we could rewind and change the consciousness back in the 70s or in the 80s, if we could change the consciousness to humanity flourishing, he would have said 2 kids. If he had said 2 kids rather than 3 kids, Bangladesh wouldn't have millions and millions and millions of people drowning and losing their land because their population, the difference between 3 kids and 2 kids, if the norm for a country is 2 kids, the population stabilizes in 20 years. With 3 kids, it's doubling every whatever it is, 30 years or something, which is what it did. And my point is that change of consciousness is important. And what's interesting, I just see that in our conversation today, that change of consciousness is a change of the future, how we speak of the future, and speaking of it as humanity flourishing, which includes our nature. And that's like the actions to take are easy. I know Professor Yunus somewhat, and I'm confident that if that had been a possible conversation in 1990 to say that women have 2 kids, he would have. It was not possible at the time, given the situation in the world.
So when you talk about the future, how do we get to that shared future? What are your thoughts with I Am Humanity, the work you're doing, and how does that, using Silicon Valley language, how does this scale? How does it become the prevalent way of humans being on the planet?
Um, I love that question. I want to come back on the program. So, we live in a world of language, and it's not so much beliefs, it's language. And one thing I've learned, and talking with the two of you over over a period of time, I think you've learned too, is that I have tendency. So, if you scare me, I will probably yell at you, maybe only for a second, but that's a quick brain response, an amygdala hijack, sometimes it's called. And knowing that it's just my amygdala, my conscious brain can quench it quickly when that thing happens. Um, Similarly, noticing that we're wired to be tribal, to be afraid when someone or something different attacks us, shows up out of the blindsides us. Knowing that that's our nature, we don't have to make it wrong. Just play some nice rock and roll music or something, calm down, and then get back to relating. So the you know there's and so my point, what I'm seeing over the last year or two working with I Am Humanity is we need to generate traditions and stories that remind us that it's okay. So, when we had our Mother Goose stories and Grimm's fairy tales, they taught us to deal with our fear, going through the forest and the fear, and we had that training to like, okay, it's okay to be scared. And so we can also build the stories and the traditions, and in a lot of places, prayer is a tradition, dancing, all of these are structures which remind us whatever we want to be reminded, in this case, that our consciousness is for humanity flourishing for millennia. Because it's important to add millennia, because as I think you said, we have billions of people who are flourishing, but they ain't going to last very long.
And are there some specific initiatives or specific things that you and your colleagues are doing to help get this out into the world?
We're developing it, and again, I'm very happy I get to work with the two of you. We have the I Am Humanity. We celebrate Humanity Day 6 months after Earth Day, or 6 months before Earth Day, and then we have our monthly uh, global monthly gatherings. And of course, Tom, you're going to be on the one coming up on Saturday. So I invite everyone listening to join that. You can find it on uh, uh, iamhumanity.net. If you go to iamhumanity.net, you can register and be on the Zoom call with Tom. I'll be on it for a little bit, and we'll be discussing more of this. And we do it every month. We have an arc. We're developing an annual tradition, much in religious traditions. So February is about passion, was about passion. April will be about, of course, the environment. So I invite everyone to join us and help grow it. Fundamentally, just share with everyone humanity flourishing for millennia to come, and then help us develop the traditions.
And one of the things that's coming up for me, Peter, is in the corporate work I've done over the last several decades, when my clients were looking at whether it was an acquisition of a company in another country, and these were primarily U.S. centric companies, or they were expanding organically. Part of the work I would help them with is to look at the culture of the company or the country that they were moving into, and we see around the world different cultures. The U.S. culture is very individualistic, and you've got, classically the Nordic countries are more collective. And so I'm wondering, when you're thinking about how do we embrace humanity flourishing, if you've given thought to where there are already cultures around the world, countries around the world that are already operating and existing that way, and how do we get a country like the U.S. that's so based on the fallacy of the individual that will make it particularly challenging to have people embrace humanity flourishing here.
Yeah, no, I love that framing that in Northern Europe, the Nordic countries, they really live like humanity flourishing. You know, when I visit there, the stability for 1,000, 2,000 years is mind-blowing to me as an American. Um, how we establish that, I think with our stories, you know, in our movies, the uh, you know, encourage people to make up stories and movies and music appropriate to humanity flourishing. What's nice is, with the challenge, of course, is that everyone wants humanity to flourish, and it's hard to have a movement without an enemy. Right. And so in this case, the enemy is the past. The enemy is that the previous chapter of tribal and national warfare, which was necessary at the time. And then now our job, especially in our country, in the US, is to overcome that. That's is to supersede that with a better possibility where we all get to flourish together. I don't know how to do that, but that's my bottom line answers. But like most problems, nice thing here in Silicon Valley is if you define the problem well, and I think you did, Tom, then the solution is going to come really quick.
I'm reminded of the story of Lynn and Bill Twist going to Ecuador, and the creation of the Pachamama Alliance. And Lynn's been on the Humanity Rising many times, and I think a lot of our audience members are familiar with them. But as I understand it, the Oshawa people, when Lynn and Bill arrived, was, if you're coming here to help us, don't waste your time, don't waste our time, because the real challenge, the real opportunity is to change the story of the global north. And that's been at the heart of the Pachamama Alliance's work. And when I hear you talking about humanity flourishing, it's very much the same. It's, how do we change the story of the global north? And it's particularly in the US and in the Western Europe.
Well, I think we're all in it together. Uh, when we say, well, we have to change the global north, well, we have to change the global south too, because it's a different world than their cultures evolved in. And you got to deal with that. Now, it's not like there's anything wrong, but it's sort of like my friends whose houses burned in the LA fire. They were upset, but then it's like, you know what? We have a different world here in Los Angeles. We'll deal with it. And they're actually very excited about dealing with it. Just they get to something new. And so, but the main thing is to really do it together. For me personally, I've adopted sort of that I'm part of the whole gestalt that had the election go the way it went last November. Um, yeah, I'm not pleased with how it went, but man, just as I was instrumental in the population explosion and all the anti-hunger and poverty work I was doing, I was instrumental in this mess. The point is that by being part of humanity, of which Donald Trump is part of humanity, now he's actually on our team. And I think that if we met with him, he would be perfectly happy to have humanity flourish. Um, but he's got his constraints in terms of his win-lose perspective. But as I said, we have soccer games where there's win-lose inside of everyone flourishing.
Yeah, the consequences are different.
Yeah, I forgot who was the economist who said, in the long run, we're all dead. That was an important thing in my house growing up. Except that that was back in the 60s. And back then when whoever it was said we're all dead, he meant individually, not collectively. And
Right.
now we're up against collectively all being dead. Again, which is why this kind of thinking is so important. And I'm just honored as heck to be here.
Well, it's important that the work that you and your colleagues are doing get out there in the world, and then fortunately you're not alone. There are lots of other folks who are carrying the same banners of humanity flourishing, and it will require the collective effort to change the story. And fundamentally, that's really, to your earlier comments, it's really just about changing the story.
Yeah. 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 When Lynn Twist came back from Ecuador and she had the instruction to change the dreamer, to awaken the dreamer. Um, that made sense back in the 90s. It doesn't make sense now because now we're all in it together, right? Back in the 90s, there was the global South and the global North. Now, our job is to weave it all together into humanity, which isn't very difficult, right? Given how many airline miles the three of us have. Um, but yes, so it's going to be a fun ride. It's going to be a very fun ride. And I think of my multicolored blip. It goes green, red, yellow, red, and then back into green. We're just riding the blip.
What's your sense of urgency and timing on it?
Um, we're set up to get over the top by 2030. So by 2030, we have the designs and plans in place to pick the methods that nature uses to get CO2 out, the methods that nature uses before ice ages, but to do it in just the right places in the ocean. It's only like less than 1% of the ocean. Um, where you accelerate the photosynthesis. And that's all it'll take for us to come over the top and come down. And then by 2050, or well before 2050, but 2050 to be back at safe levels. So, our kids will have a safe planet. It's just mind blowing. And it's the design. There's no opposition. When I talk to the scientists who do the research, to a large degree, they worry about the opposition. When I say, well, physically, is there a problem? I say, no, physically, it's the energy and all that stuff. It's not a big deal. The energy it takes to get that much CO2 back out of the air, as I said, is the energy of sunlight on 1% or 0.5% of the ocean with the efficiency that phytoplankton have. It's really that easy physically. But people think that the antagonisms are real, are physical. They're real in language, but the antagonism I might have against the U.S. administration is just language. I'm still going about my business, and so we can remind each other it doesn't have to be difficult because we all want the same thing. It's just that we have a tradition of defeating the enemy. And once we acknowledge we just have that tradition, and probably always will because it's probably hardwired, then we can set that tradition aside and dance and play together. But the structure to keep that reminder in place it seems to be the key, the thing that I want us to invent together, that structure.
Just on a personal level, what would you say you're flourishing in your personal life, and what does that look like for you?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, yes. Because I'm healthy. I've got my wife and my grandkids. My grandkids live down the street, and wild adventures in life. And it's interesting because my brain worries about things all the time, but when I calm down, I realize it's fine. Yes, I have to transfer money from this account to that account to make payroll this month, but yeah, that's part of the changing world. Yes, I consider myself flourishing. And I've never asked that before. That's interesting. How about you?
For me, I view myself like any other species as a complex being, and there are dimensions, there are parts of my life that absolutely are flourishing, and there are parts that I would say are deficient in their various ways, and I think it's a natural response as a human to focus on those areas that aren't flourishing and wanting
Yes.
to tend to them. And oftentimes that's at the expense of the areas that are flourishing.
Yeah, I said if I propose to you that that's what flourishing looks like, is going through those stressful times and coming back. Again, just like that blip, we're going through overpopulation, which then leads to the CO2 levels going up and then come back down. Because the world, the universe is dynamic. There's asteroids, there's earthquakes, there's volcanoes. There's plate tectonics and mountains growing and things going under. It's constant change. There's always going to be stress. There's the status quo that our body loves. The nice soft jazz music with a glass of wine. And then there's the times when the storm blows it all out the window and we have to deal with it. And all that is obviously part of humanity flourishing.
Jim, what about you?
Well, I'm conscious of the time, so I won't say much, but I want to bring in uh, one question from Rita Marsh, which I think is important to contemplate. And that, Peter, is how you define humanity rising to include the role and the consciousness of Gaia.
Oh, I love that. I saw only one note, and that's the only note that I saw on the text there. Uh, totally. There is no humanity without nature, without Gaia. Now, whether you attribute Gaia as a personality or spiritual. Uh, as a scientist, I have no problem with that, but I do it, as you've heard, very scientifically, just because that's the language that I have. But the name of the game is if you look at humanity flourishing, which and nature, because there's no humanity without nature. Um, if you see that flourishing for eons to come, well, of course, we're going to take care of nature. And we want nature to flourish. We want new species coming up. We want new ecosystems coming up, whether they're in our own personal little garden or, on some island that happens to be arising in the middle of the Pacific. That all of that is humanity flourishing, right? Because it would be a lonely planet if it were static. So, there's changes, but yeah, so great question. Uh, I think everyone asks that. Everyone says when I talk about humanity flourishing, everyone says, "Well, what about nature? What about Gaia?" Like, well, of course, absolutely. And isn't it bizarre that we even have to ask?
Well, it's interesting if we take the thought further, uh, this isn't about humanity flourishing. This is about Gaia flourishing. If we are nature and nature precedes us and we're derivative of nature, then to ask the question of what it takes for humanity to flourish, I would have thought is really needs to be expanded to ask the question of Gaia flourishing.
Oh,
right?
this is really important, Jim. This is really important. So, if you look at the UN climate goals to stabilize the CO2 level so that nature flourishes, that's not their exact words, but that's absolutely what their goal is. Stabilize the climate so that nature flourishes. They forgot to say, no, not just any nature, because the CO2 level today is higher than it's been since 10 million years before the first hominids evolved. That's how horrible the climate is. Now,
Mhm.
we might survive, I don't know, but as a human, I want humanity to survive because, you know, for no, just because I think we're cool. Now, the UN says what you were just saying. It's like, it doesn't matter. As long as nature is happy, if we go extinct, that's fine. They don't say that literally, but if you look at the implication of what they say, they just stabilize it and don't worry about humans. So my point is, there's a certain nature that we want. While we're on the stage, we want the nature that again, what's called the Holocene, which allowed us to survive and flourish. Um, and we'll all be dead in a number of decades, and whatever happens, happens. But for the moment, that's the game I'm playing, and I think that's the game you guys are playing. Is let's not just any nature, but the nature that allows our future generations to sing and dance together.
Yeah, although I think where I would stress the flourishing, given Rita's question, is to begin to probe the design question again. If we are the separate from nature, which has been the prevailing narrative and worldview,
Mm-hmm.
then we don't have to ask the design question other than some religious ethic or mythology that has been developed over time. If you understand James Lovelock and you understand that Gaia produced us, then the real question about humanity flourishing and human flourishing is, well, what does the mother intend? Why, why did she produce us? And I think that question has never really been fully framed and fully aired because we're so focused on human and humanity. And I think Rita's question would be even bigger if we understand that Gaia was a creation of another intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that there's a connection between that other intelligence and Earth intelligence and human intelligence and the extraterrestrials that are showing up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That in fact, if we think about it, everybody, within what Peter's been saying, we're on the vestibule of a literal explosion of human consciousness, where we're going from using Maslow's hierarchy of being or Ken Wilber's hierarchy of being, where you go from egocentric to ethnocentric to world centric to cosmic centric. So that really what's happening is you're pointing the way from ethnocentricity, Russians against the Americans, the Chinese, so forth and so on, to a world centric humanity where Rita's pushing us is beyond world centric to nature centric and Gaia centric. And given the ETs coming in, we're being compelled to push it even further out into the cosmos and the intelligence that's guiding the whole thing. So it's like layers of the onion at some level. And I think it's important for us to distinguish between the layers
Yeah.
and then ask the question how, once we get the bigger layer, how that informs our self-definitions. Because that's what to me is so delicious about our moment in history is all the categories of cognition are being exploded by reality itself.
Yes. Yeah, Jim, that point is so precious. You can imagine I spent many, many years grappling with it because my climate vision is diametrically opposed to the UN climate mission, right? The UN climate mission is really based on Gaia. And the fact that it leads to humans going, very likely going extinct is okay as long as that's Gaia's intention. And then, I come here and say, as a human, I really care about my grandkids. And there's the Gaia of 14 million years ago, with whatever that situation was, a very hot planet. And there's the Gaia that we have now. Is one better than the other? Well, you know what? One asteroid would totally undo whatever you might think, Jim, that Gaia is thinking. So, uh, it's a thorny situation for me and a lot of us when we actually think about it and say, "Oh my God, uh, are we willing to make sure that our future generations of humanity survive, even though, it's pretty obvious that Gaia wants to flick us off like a flea." And all we have to do is, this $1 billion a year of putting dust in like 1 million square kilometers of the ocean, less than 1% of the ocean.
See, I don't think Gaia wants to flick us off like a flea. I think Gaia is doing everything she can to wake us up so she doesn't have to do that.
The blip. We could rename that to Gaia's blip.
Are we Gaia's blip?
Right, right. I'm going to pull up the blip here, see if I can. I don't know if I can share it. We'll see if that works. Oh, it works.
Well, we see it with other species. The classic are the lemmings that will control their population, and I'm just wondering, Peter or Jim, if that's part of our consciousness where we have a self-correcting mechanism.
Yeah, let us hope and pray.
Yeah, well, we definitely want to pray. I'm not so big on hope. Let's plan and pray. Because what's
You
great
can't
about
leave out hope, man. Hope is from the heart. Planning is from the head.
yeah, but you need all of that because
Pray is from the soul, man.
right. Well, yeah, I'd like that, Jim. The hope is from the heart. Yeah, that's why I've taken on making sure our grandkids survive. And then the planning is from the brain, but um, the prayers are from the spiritual world, from the all of humanity, and you need all three of those. But that's nothing new. But my point is, it's got to be all three of those. But I like that. We could say that that's that blip is our spiritual goal.
Let me ask one final question because this takes us sort of beyond Rita's question back to the original question that we pondered around design. In my view, which I'd love to have your comment on, and yours too, Tom. In my view, the reason why humanity has been designed as it is by Gaia with intention over eons of time is because we're that species that she is designed to take her consciousness off planet. You think about where we are in time now with what President Kennedy did and subsequent space flight, humans are now leaving planet Earth and we're probing the rest of the solar system and the local galaxy. We're the only species, as far as we know, that Gaia has produced that's capable of doing that. So, in my view, how I would orient my reflection around the human design question is at two fundamental levels. One is we need to be conscious of the fact that that's why we're here, that in some mysterious way, Gaia wants part of herself, a conscious part of herself, to be able to take her consciousness as ambassadors and emissaries to other life forms in different parts of the cosmic whole. And therefore, the second design issue, and this is where we ran into problems. And because we did that, we forgot the design we were created to achieve, is that we need to, in some ways, sink back into the mother to more fully understand the genius of Gaia and the extraordinary intelligence of Gaia, so that as we take this consciousness out, we're in complete alignment with Gaia. So that seems to me to be the future, and I would just conclude it with the metaphor of the bee and the bees, because I don't believe that we're higher than they are. We're purposed differently, but part of the reasons why we are on the verge of self-destruction is that we have forgotten what it means to be either a bee or a beehive. And we have to be able to return to what Jung calls that instinctive faculty of ourselves that keeps us in alignment with nature. And if you think about it from a Jungian point of view, the essence of our predicament is that we've gone up into our heads, into consciousness, and we've lost our instinct. So the very purpose for which we have been created, namely to take this out there, is proportionally linked to our capacity to stay deeply in her. And that's really what's being played out in our time, is whether humans can become aware of their humanity, not in isolation with Gaia, but as integral to Gaia, as manifestations of Gaia. And it is within that consciousness that we'll find our deep purpose. Does that make any sense to you?
It does. It does. I love the way you ended it with integral with Gaia. And uh, as I study philosophy and neuroscience, a very interesting distinction shows up for me, which is, our brains develop, our individual brains, my personal brain developed, starting from, you know, before birth and as an infant and so on, and learn to relate to parents, right? The parents knew everything. They were gods. I'm not, I remember that experience that of course they know everything, and then we get a little older and realize they don't know everything. And sometimes they bullshit us and sometimes they're good gods, sometimes they're bad gods. But there's a relating to them in a certain way and relating to authorities in a certain way. And the I am humanity, I call it a bar mitzvah for humanity, where we go from being adolescent and trying to understand everything to being adults where we're responsible and accountable, where we don't have to understand everything. We just have to keep our eyes open for where we are and where we're going.
Mm.
And as adults, we get to say where we're going. This is when my dad left teaching at a college in LA and went to Washington to work in Washington. He just decided that, but he didn't ask Gaia. And the same way,
Maybe he should have.
that's right. But
You may have given him another directive.
that's right. Um, I invite you and everyone to look from
Yeah.
that we have a natural in our brain desire to look for the truth, because that's what we do when we're young. And then we have to over and over again put ourselves through that coming of age. In Judaism, we call it bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, uh, where you become an adult. And over a period of decades, you then become accountable for the community where they come to you. And that's probably why Gaia gave us gray hair at this age. It's like, you know what? We're through raising our families. Our job now is to watch out for the future for humanity.
Tom, any closing comments?
Some of my thoughts that are still half baked at best. It's interesting, Jim, if your thesis is right, that our responsibility as humanity is to take Gaia out into the cosmos. Well, we've liberated all of this carbon from the Earth into the atmosphere. It's much easier to access if it's a source of energy to travel into the cosmos. I'm going to ponder this conversation. It's not something I can quickly respond to. It's been provocative, and it's been fun watching the chat. I saw a reference. Somebody said this has been the best 5 minutes of Humanity Rising ever, and it's been an enjoyable morning with both of you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Peter. And I would underscore the comment in the chat, Peter. I think this what we've done in this session is really ponder the deep questions that are implicit in the notions of humanity flourishing, recognizing that they're not easy answers, but the mere pondering of the questions is what we humans need to be doing at this time. So you've really done a service, in parsing your language. It's not human flourishing we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen. It's humanity flourishing, because that shift from the ethno to the world-centric is exactly where we need to end up. And you've been pushing it in your own way, with great courage and intellectual astuteness. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to acknowledge your leadership. It's been an inspiration, and let's agree to have you back.
I'll be happy to. I just have to add,
Sure.
when I look again as a scientist and I look into the future, the only future is where we restore the climate. Because where we don't restore the climate, there's no one to tell the story that we lost the game.
Exactly.
So it's like, that's it. We won the game already. Now let's just play.
Well, if we can do that, my friend, we will have accomplished a great deed. So thank you so much for your work on this. So that'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. You can join Peter in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. Tom just put it in. You received the link in your Zoom reminder for today. And then tomorrow, we're going to shift to this extraordinary relationship that has been observed over time between nuclear weapons and UFOs. And we're going to talk to Colonel Peter Corso, who was one of the first U.S. military personnel to understand that one of the fundamental reasons why the UFOs were appearing is that the United States and Russia and China had in their possession nuclear weapons. And that'll be our session tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. That's it for now. Thanks again, Peter, Tom.
Thank you all.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Tom.